The most silent but powerful truth about human existence is that time itself is not limited for the world, yet it is profoundly limited for the human being who lives within it. The Earth has rotated for billions of years before any person reading these words was born, and it will continue its quiet movement long after every current generation disappears. Rivers will keep flowing, seasons will keep changing, and civilizations will continue their endless cycles of growth, transformation, and decline. The universe does not rush, the oceans do not panic, and the sky does not fear the passing of years. Yet within this vast and patient universe stands the human life, brief and delicate, measured not in centuries, but in moments that pass quietly and never return. From the first breath to the last, a human being moves through a limited span of years that feels long when imagined but surprisingly short when experienced. Childhood seems to pass in a blink. Youth dissolves into responsibility, and before one realizes it, decades have already moved into memory. Because of this fragile limitation, the most valuable resource a person truly possesses is not wealth, reputation, or status, but attention and time. Everything a human becomes is shaped by where these two invisible assets are invested. Yet despite this reality, people often behave as if attention and time are infinite. They allow themselves to be pulled into endless discussions, emotional debates, unnecessary hearings, idle gossip, and repetitive complaints that drain hours from their lives without giving anything meaningful in return. Many individuals develop the habit of listening to everything and everyone simply because social expectation encourages constant engagement. If someone complains, we feel obligated to hear it. If someone argues, we feel compelled to respond. If someone spreads rumors or criticism, we instinctively want to defend ourselves or add our voice to the conversation. Gradually, this pattern becomes so common that most people rarely pause to question whether these interactions deserve their attention at all. They simply participate because participation has become automatic. However, the moment a person becomes deeply aware of the limited nature of their life, their relationship with conversations begins to change. They start to realize that not every voice deserves their ear and not every topic deserves their mind. Listening is not merely a passive act. It is an investment of mental energy. Every conversation occupies a portion of your awareness, influences your emotions, and shapes your thinking. When you listen repeatedly to negativity, arguments, or gossip, those patterns slowly become part of your internal environment. Your thoughts become heavier, your patience becomes thinner, and your clarity begins to fade. What seemed like harmless discussions gradually accumulate into mental fatigue. Avoiding unnecessary hearings, therefore, begins with a powerful shift in perspective. Instead of assuming that every conversation deserves participation, a person learns to view attention as a valuable currency. Just as wise individuals do not spend money carelessly, wise thinkers do not spend attention carelessly either. They recognize that every moment spent listening to something meaningless is a moment that cannot be used for learning, reflection, creativity, or meaningful relationships. Once time passes, it cannot be reclaimed, repaired, or extended. The minutes lost to pointless argument will never return to the person who gave them away. This awareness creates a quiet discipline within the mind, a discipline that encourages careful selection of what deserves focus and what is not. Another important realization is that much of the noise people hear every day is not created for growth or understanding. Many conversations exist simply because humans are emotional beings who seek validation for their feelings. Someone complains not because they expect a solution, but because they want agreement. Someone argues not because they seek truth, but because they desire victory. Someone spreads gossip, not because it improves anyone's life, but because it creates temporary excitement or a sense of belonging within a group. When viewed from distance, these patterns become surprisingly repetitive. The same conflicts appear in different words. The same complaints return in different situations, and the same emotional reactions repeat across countless conversations. A A person who listens without awareness becomes trapped in this cycle of repetition. They hear the same negativity again and again until their mind becomes filled with problems that were never theirs to carry. Over time, this habit quietly steals intellectual energy and emotional stability. Instead of focusing on building ideas, solving meaningful challenges, or expanding knowledge, the mind becomes occupied with issues that have no real value. This is one of the greatest hidden costs of unnecessary hearings. It does not always appear dramatic or obvious, yet gradually erodes the ability to think deeply and act purposefully. The alternative approach is not to become cold, arrogant, or dismissive toward others. Avoiding unnecessary hearings is not about rejecting people, but about protecting clarity. A wise person still listens when listening truly matters. They listen carefully when someone seeks genuine guidance, when a conversation brings knowledge, when a problem requires thoughtful cooperation, or when a meaningful relationship needs understanding. In these situations, listening becomes powerful because it contributes to growth, connection, and wisdom. But outside these meaningful contexts, they allow themselves the freedom to remain silent or disengaged. Silence in such moments is not weakness. It is discipline. The ability to remain silent when a discussion offers nothing valuable is a form of mental strength that many people never develop. It requires confidence to step away from conversations that others continue out of habit. It requires awareness to recognize when engagement will only produce more confusion rather than clarity. Most importantly, it requires respect for one's own limited time on earth. When a person truly understands that their life is finite, they begin to guard their attention with care. Another key element in avoiding unnecessary hearings is learning the difference between information and noise. Information expands understanding and helps a person navigate the world more intelligently. Noise, on the other hand, only stimulates temporary emotion without contributing any lasting insight. For example, learning a new concept, hearing a thoughtful perspective, or discussing an important problem can sharpen the mind and inspire progress. But listening to endless complaints about the same issues rarely produces solutions. Similarly, participating in debates driven by ego rather than curiosity rarely leads to truth. The challenge is that noise often disguises itself as importance. It may appear urgent, dramatic, or emotionally intense, which tricks the mind into believing it deserves attention. In reality, it simply consumes mental space. Developing the skill to distinguish between these two categories requires practice. At first, a person may still find themselves drawn into unnecessary discussions simply because the habit of engagement is deeply ingrained. But with growing awareness, they begin to pause and ask a simple question before investing their attention. Does this conversation improve understanding, strengthen a meaningful relationship, or help solve a real problem? If the answer is no, the mind gradually learns to step back rather than dive deeper. Over time, this simple habit transforms the way a person experiences daily life. Instead of being surrounded by constant mental clutter, the individual begins to experience greater clarity. Their thoughts become calmer because they are not overloaded with irrelevant information. Their emotional energy becomes more stable because they are not constantly reacting to other people's frustrations. Most importantly, they regain control of their own time. The hours that once disappeared into pointless discussions can now be used for learning, planning, creating, or simply reflecting in silence. This shift may appear small from the outside, yet it has profound consequences over the course of a lifetime. When someone consistently protects their attention from unnecessary hearings, they accumulate thousands of extra hours of focused thought. Those hours gradually transform into knowledge, wisdom, and meaningful accomplishments. Meanwhile, others who continue to listen to everything around them often feel permanently busy, yet strangely unfulfilled, because much of their time has been spent reacting rather than creating. Understanding this difference marks the beginning of a new relationship with time itself. The world continues to move at its vast and patient pace, but the individual life within it becomes more deliberate and purposeful. Every conversation is evaluated not by its volume or excitement, but by its value. Every moment of attention is treated as a limited resource rather than an endless supply. From this awareness emerges a quiet freedom. The freedom to choose what deserves your mind and what does not. The freedom to walk away from noise without guilt. The freedom to invest your limited years into things that genuinely enrich your life and the lives of others. Once a person begins to understand that time is limited for the human being and not for the world, the next step is to understand why unnecessary hearings are so common in human life. The reason lies deeply within human psychology. Human beings are not only logical creatures, but emotional and social ones. A large portion of daily conversation is not created for the purpose of exchanging knowledge or discovering truth. Instead, it exists to satisfy emotional needs such as validation, belonging, attention, or the release of frustration. Because of this, many discussions continue long after their useful value has ended. People repeat the same stories, the same complaints, and the same arguments because the emotional relief of speaking feels more immediate than the effort required to solve a problem. When someone complains about the same situation again and again, it is often not because they expect a new solution, but because they feel temporarily lighter after expressing their frustration. If another person listens and agrees, that emotional relief becomes stronger and the habit of repeating the complaint becomes even more deeply rooted. Understanding this pattern is essential if one wishes to avoid unnecessary hearings without damaging relationships. When you recognize that many conversations are driven by emotional cycles rather than rational goals, you begin to see them with a different clarity. Instead of assuming that every complaint requires deep attention, you start observing the structure of the conversation itself. Does the person seek understanding or simply agreement? Do they show interest in solutions, or do they return repeatedly to the same dissatisfaction? Do they listen as much as they speak, or does the discussion revolve entirely around their perspective? These small observations reveal whether a conversation is moving toward resolution or simply circling within an emotional loop. One of the most common forms of unnecessary hearing is repetitive complaining. In many social environments, people bond through shared dissatisfaction. They talk about problems at work, frustrations with other people, disappointments in life, or unfair situations they believe they are facing. In small amounts, such conversations can be natural and even healthy because expressing emotions can reduce stress. However, the problem arises when complaining becomes habitual, rather than temporary. Instead of discussing a problem once and moving toward improvement, the same complaint is repeated daily with no effort to change the underlying situation. The listener in such conversations gradually becomes an emotional container for problems that never disappear. Hours are spent listening, yet nothing improves for either person involved. A wise individual learns to recognize this cycle early. Rather than encouraging endless repetition, they gently guide the conversation toward clarity. They might ask calm and constructive questions that shift the focus from emotion toward action. For example, they may ask what possible solutions exist or what steps the person might take to improve the situation. If the speaker shows interest in exploring those possibilities, the conversation becomes meaningful and productive. If the speaker avoids solutions and returns immediately to emotional repetition, it becomes clear that the discussion is not truly about improvement, but about releasing frustration. At that point, it is reasonable to reduce engagement and gradually redirect attention elsewhere. Another common source of unnecessary hearings is gossip. Gossip appears harmless in many social settings because it often begins as casual curiosity about the lives of others. Yet its deeper effect on the mind is rarely considered. When people spend large amounts of time discussing individuals who are not present, the conversation often shifts toward speculation, judgment, or exaggeration. The mind becomes occupied with details that provide no personal growth and no useful knowledge. More importantly, gossip subtly changes the way people think about one another. Instead of seeing individuals as complex human beings with strengths and weaknesses, They become simplified stories passed between listeners. Over time, this habit reduces empathy and increases suspicion within communities. Avoiding unnecessary hearings, therefore, includes developing resistance to gossip-based discussions. This does not require confrontation or criticism of others. Often a simple change of topic is enough to dissolve the momentum of gossip. When someone introduces information about another person's private affairs, the wise listener neither encourages nor expands the topic. They may respond briefly without emotional involvement, and then move the conversation towards something constructive or neutral. In many cases, the conversation fades naturally because gossip requires enthusiastic participation to continue. Without that participation, it quickly loses its energy. Arguments driven by ego form another major category of unnecessary hearings. Human beings possess a strong desire to appear correct, knowledgeable, and respected. When opinions clash, especially on topics connected to identity or personal belief, discussions can quickly transform into battles of pride rather than explorations of truth. In such debates, each participant focuses more on defending their own position than understanding the perspective of the other. Voices become louder, patience becomes thinner, and the original purpose of the conversation disappears entirely. Even if one person eventually wins the argument, the outcome rarely produces deeper understanding. Instead, it often leaves behind tension, resentment, or emotional exhaustion. Recognizing ego-driven arguments allows a person to step away before they escalate. One useful mental habit is to ask whether the conversation is producing new insight. If the participants are exchanging ideas respectfully and genuinely exploring a topic, the discussion may still hold value. But if the same points are repeated again and again without progress, it becomes clear that the debate has transformed into a contest of pride. At this stage, continuing the conversation rarely benefits anyone. The most intelligent response is calm disengagement. A person might acknowledge the difference of opinion and simply allow the discussion to end rather than forcing it to continue. Many people fear that withdrawing from such discussions will make them appear weak or uninterested. In reality, the opposite is often true. The ability to disengage from pointless arguments demonstrates emotional maturity and self-control. It shows that a person values understanding more than victory and clarity more than noise. Over time, others begin to notice this pattern and approach the individual differently. They realize that emotional drama will not receive attention, while thoughtful dialogue will be welcomed. As a result, the quality of conversations around that person gradually improves. Another subtle source of unnecessary hearings comes from a human tendency to react immediately to criticism. When someone speaks negatively about us or questions our actions, the instinctive response is to defend ourselves. This reaction is deeply rooted in the desire to protect reputation and identity. Yet responding to every criticism often multiplies the amount of time spent in unproductive dialogue. Some criticism contains useful insight and deserves careful attention. But a significant portion of criticism in everyday life is impulsive, emotional, or based on incomplete understanding. Engaging deeply with every such remark can trap a person in endless cycles of explanation and justification. A more balanced approach involves distinguishing between constructive feedback and emotional reaction. Constructive feedback contains specific observations that can lead to improvement. Even when it feels uncomfortable, listening carefully to such input can strengthen personal growth. Emotional criticism, however, usually appears as vague accusations or harsh judgments that lack useful detail. Responding extensively to such comments rarely changes the critic's perspective. Instead, it simply prolongs the conflict. Learning to respond calmly and briefly, or sometimes not at all, protects valuable mental energy. Another powerful strategy in avoiding unnecessary hearings is the development of conversational boundaries. Boundaries are not walls that isolate us from others, but guidelines that define how our time and attention are used. For example, a person may decide that certain times of the day are reserved for focused work, reading, or reflection. During these periods, They minimize casual conversation unless something truly important arises. They may also limit discussions that repeatedly lead to negativity or emotional exhaustion. These boundaries communicate, sometimes silently, that their attention is purposeful rather than endlessly available. The long-term effect of these practices is significant. As unnecessary hearings decrease, the mind gradually becomes clearer and more organized. Instead of carrying fragments of dozens of unrelated conversations, the brain has space to think deeply about meaningful ideas. Creativity improves because mental energy is no longer scattered across endless social noise. Decision-making becomes easier because attention is focused on relevant information rather than emotional distractions. Even relationships improve because conversations that remain tend to be more thoughtful and sincere rather than routine exchanges of complaint or gossip. Perhaps the most important change occurs internally. When a person consistently avoids unnecessary hearings, they begin to experience a quiet sense of control over their own life. Instead of feeling pulled in every direction by other people's emotions or opinions, they become the guardian of their own attention. This does not mean they stop caring about others. On the contrary, it allows them to listen more deeply when listening truly matters. Because their mind is not exhausted by constant noise, they can offer genuine presence during meaningful conversations. In this way, selective listening transforms both personal growth and social interaction. Time that once disappeared into endless discussion becomes available for learning, reflection, creativity, and purposeful action. The human life remains limited, just as it always was, but the way that limited time is used becomes far more intentional. The individual who understands the psychology behind unnecessary hearings no longer participates in them automatically. Instead, they observe carefully, choose wisely, and invest their attention where it creates understanding, progress, and meaningful connection. After understanding that time is limited for the human being, and after recognizing the psychological patterns that produce unnecessary conversations, the next step is to develop practical methods that allow a person to protect their attention in daily life. Awareness alone is not enough, because habits of listening and reacting have often been built over many years. People are conditioned by their social environments to respond immediately, to participate in every discussion, and to give their attention to anyone who demands it. Breaking this pattern requires deliberate practices that reshape how a person manages conversations, attention, and mental energy. The goal is not to isolate oneself from society, but to become intentional about where listening truly belongs. The first practical technique is the development of an internal filter for conversations. This filter functions as a silent question that appears in the mind whenever someone begins speaking about a topic that demands attention. The question is simple but powerful. Does this conversation bring knowledge, understanding, or constructive progress into my life or the life of the person speaking? If the answer is yes, then listening becomes meaningful and worthwhile. If the answer is uncertain, the conversation may still deserve brief attention while its direction becomes clear. If the answer is clearly no, then it becomes wise to limit engagement. This internal filter works quietly and quickly once it becomes a habit. Instead of reacting automatically to every discussion, the mind pauses for a moment and evaluates the value of what is being said. Over time, this small pause transforms the entire experience of communication. Another essential technique is learning the art of controlled response. Many unnecessary hearings continue simply because the listener encourages them without realizing it. When someone repeatedly complains or speaks about topics that have no real value, enthusiastic responses can unintentionally invite them to continue. Even expressions of strong agreement or emotional reaction can extend the discussion. Controlled response means replying in a calm and measured way that neither encourages negativity nor creates conflict. Short and neutral responses gradually reduce the momentum of conversations that do not deserve extended attention. When the listener does not feed emotional energy into the topic, the speaker often moves on naturally or ends the discussion on their own. Equally important is the skill of redirecting conversations. Sometimes a discussion begins in an unproductive direction, but can be guided towards something more meaningful. Instead of abruptly ending the interaction, a person may introduce a thoughtful question or shift the focus to a constructive topic. For example, when someone begins repeating a familiar complaint, the listener may ask what steps might improve the situation or what new ideas have been considered. This shift gently moves the conversation from emotional repetition toward problem solving. If the speaker responds positively, the dialogue becomes productive. If they resist and return to the same complaint, the listener gains confirmation that the discussion is unlikely to produce value. In such situations, gradually reducing participation becomes appropriate. Another powerful method for avoiding unnecessary hearings is the conscious design of one's daily environment. The type of conversations a person experiences often depends on the social and informational environments they occupy. If someone spends large amounts of time in settings where gossip, negativity, or endless argument dominate, it becomes difficult to maintain mental clarity. On the other hand, environments that encourage curiosity, learning, and thoughtful discussion naturally reduce the presence of meaningless dialogue. Choosing where to spend time and with whom to interact, therefore, plays a significant role in shaping the quality of conversations in one's life. Even small changes in daily routine can shift this environment. Spending more time reading, studying, or engaging with thoughtful individuals gradually replaces superficial conversations with deeper exchanges of ideas. Another important habit involves creating deliberate periods of silence throughout the day. Modern life surrounds individuals with constant streams of information and conversation. Messages arrive continuously through phones, social media, and casual interactions. This constant flow prevents the mind from processing experiences deeply. By establishing quiet intervals where unnecessary communication is avoided, a person allows their mind to settle and organize thoughts. These silent periods do not need to be long. Even short moments of reflection during the day can restore mental clarity. During such time, the mind can review priorities, reflect on meaningful goals, and regain focus. Silence becomes a protective space where attention is no longer scattered among countless voices. Learning to politely end conversations is another skill that helps reduce unnecessary hearings. Many people remain in discussions longer than necessary simply because they feel uncomfortable leaving. Social courtesy sometimes makes individuals believe they must continue listening even when the topic has become repetitive or irrelevant. However, respectful closure is entirely possible without causing offense. Simple expressions of appreciation for the conversation, followed by a clear statement about needing to attend to other responsibilities, allow a person to